Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Scott R. Levy, who's the author of a new book I'm holding in my hands for the viewers at home. It's Why School Boards Matter, Reclaiming the Heart of American Education and Democracy. Really made me think there's a lot to dive into, so we're going to talk a lot about school boards today. Scott, welcome to Trending in Education.
Well, Mike, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's great to have you. And we always start by getting to know you a little bit better, which is something that's actually outlined really at the top of the book. Can you catch folks up on who you are? And then we'll get into more about why school boards matter.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City in a place called Rockland County. And it's relevant because when I was a very young child, my mom was a kindergarten teacher of 30 plus years in public schools. And she used to take me into her classroom every year in late August to set the classroom up. And so we would do the block corner and we would set up the books. And I would watch with excitement as, she was welcoming these, 5-year-old children into a classroom for the first time in public school. And it was inspiring growing up. And then I had my own public school experience, attending school all the way K through 12 in the public system. And I enjoyed every minute of it, and it prepared me really well for college. And then when I went off to college, I was most focused on economics, and I was looking to go to Wall Street and really just business. But there was a big part of me that also was really focused on education as well. And I wrote a thesis when I was in college on inner city high school students and summer jobs, and whether summer jobs would increase their chances of graduating from high school, ultimately attending college, making strong wages once they became an adult. And so in the back of my mind, I was always focused on education policy and job training, but I did go to Wall Street and spent, 20 great years there doing a lot of interesting things with a lot of different companies.
Yeah.
And then kind of, put education in the back seat. But when I had 3 children and, they started to go to school themselves and they were attending public school, I decided to get involved, as many decide to do. And I joined this nonprofit that was charged with raising money to fund innovative projects in public schools. And I became chair of this nonprofit. And for 20 years, it had been around, and teachers and administrators came up with ideas. And then the board, comprised of parents, would decide whether to fund the ideas or not. I became chairman, and it's just stopped overnight coming. I'm like, what's going on? Is it something that I'm doing with my leadership style? It turned out that it was Race to the Top, which was federal program that New York State very aggressively rolled out in about 2013-14 timeframe. And I realized that that was having a lot of unintended negative consequences on our school district. And a lot of these ideas had come from the business world around Race to the Top, around standardization and data and competition. And I was this business guy, and I was looking at how they were being implemented, not really recognizing the type of business ideas that were being implemented compared to the business that I'd done on Wall Street. So there was a disconnect. And at first, it was just my district, which was relatively well-resourced in the suburbs. But then I went to this forum in Portchester, New York, and I was exposed to parents and school board members and teachers literally from dozens and dozens of districts around my area. And to a T, it doesn't matter whether the district was low resource, high resource, majority white, majority non-white, to a T, everyone was very frustrated with this government program and saw the unintended consequences happening. And that's when I stood back and said, you know what? I really want to dive into this and do something about it, because I think there's a disservice being done to a lot of kids. And I want to figure out why this has gone so wrong.
And that led to you throwing your hat in the ring for another board. We should get into a little bit your perspective on the different types of boards, because coming out of the private sector and investing in companies, even the nonprofits, that type of board is very different than a board of education. But you did decide, and I guess based on your knowledge of the situation, the place to really make the impact was to join your school board. Can you catch us up on how that evolved?
So what I decided to do after Portchester is I actually left banking, which is a big decision. I decided I had 20 great years and I wanted to dive into education. And I ended up doing a fellowship where I studied the rollout of Race to the Top in New York State. And I did that for a year. And it was really at the end of that year, after looking at what was certainly a well-intended set of reforms that were trying to improve education, that really did backfire because of the way that they were rolled out and some of their underlying principles. I decided at that point, you know what? I think the best way for me to make a difference is to try to run for my local school board. And That's how it started. In 2015, I decided to run,
Mhm.
and then I got on the board and have been on the board ever since. And it's really, my way at certainly a local level, but my way of trying to, make the system as thoughtful as possible as, we have all these kids going through our K-12 system. So that was the beginning of my school board journey.
Yeah. And, it sounds like that beginning, you started with a lot of perspective, having already chaired a board and just kind of understanding how folks think about governance. Governance is a kind of abstract concept and people don't always understand it as well. And then you add to it the idea that unlike other boards, private boards and boards of nonprofits and whatnot, it's not an appointment, it's an election. And folks actually have to win the court of public opinion and get people motivated to vote. Voter engagement and low voter rates among school board elections is something you get into in the book. But it is, think globally, act locally. If you're going to act locally, the place where you probably have the most influence is in a school board. How about that? Because, the period of time, your tenure here spanned kind of the before times of up until 2020, and then the last 5 years where we've all been, aging in dog years in terms of the amount of activity. School boards went from sort of a quiet part of how our civic society operates to become something that people were looking at and talking about. It became part of our public consciousness in the COVID years into George Floyd. What's that ride been like? And, perspectives on how the US public understands school boards and understands really their role in our democracy.
That was really the genesis of the book because I did see this disconnect. The first few years that I was on the school board, things were relatively quiet. And I remember in 2015 when I first won, I'm walking down the street in my hometown and somebody stopped me. They're like, "Oh, Scott, congratulations on winning the election. And I'm going to now see you on TV when I watch the school board meetings." And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
wow, somebody actually watches the school board meetings. I think nobody usually watches the school board meetings because they do go into deep, budget lines and
Yeah.
policy language. And then, he continued to say, "Well, actually, I've been having trouble falling asleep lately, and the school board things are really helpful. I can, fall asleep really easily." And, meetings generally were quite mundane. And then all of a sudden, obviously during COVID, they take a total turn.
Right.
And to your point, first it was school reopening, then masking, then vaccinations, and then it translates into post George Floyd, many different DEI issues. And, there's flash of, oh, is there CRT being taught here? But when you really look at what was being argued in boardrooms, there were a lot of policy issues that related to DEI. It could be school disciplinary style. It could be how kids get into magnet schools, whether it's by taking a test or some representative measure pulling from all the schools in the district, how to teach history. It was whether to have advanced coursework. It was
Right.
do DEI training.
The AP in African American history became
Exactly in
the
Florida. That's
flashpoint. Yeah.
exactly right. So there's so many issues. And so it went from this, this generally mundane, set of meetings to all of a sudden, these shouting matches. And I really decided that I wanted to write a book to try to dive into, has it always been this way? Was it always quiet? And now all of a sudden it's different.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I noticed, and this is now drawing from the business world, even though I am critical of some of the ideas that were brought forth from business into education during Race to the Top, I think there's a lot, certainly of parallel between business world and the corporate world, and then the education world. And when you think about boards, I noticed the dichotomy. So if you think about the way boards are treated in the world of business, there are very few people that would argue that they're incredibly important. They're the way we govern organizations. They always have been. They're studied by business school students. They're researched by faculty. Out in the real world, when you're investing in a company, you think about board governance. If you're a company, you often think about, the board and what the board is going to do. Boards are very central.
Just to jump in real quick, the term that was jumping to mind when you were talking was around accountability. And in the private sector, there is that awareness that even if you hire an amazing CEO, they need to be held accountable. And, governance is sort of an abstract thing, but I think accountability is something that resonates with folks nowadays. And I was happy that that was something you got into in the book as well.
For sure, because even that decision of who to hire is the board that makes
Yes.
it. And then ultimately, whether they're doing a good job or not is determined by the board. And then you go to the education world, and school boards weren't really a focus in education schools across the board. Very little coursework. If you look at the research, it was less than 1% of research done on school boards, and you think about the other categories in education where there's been tremendous scholarship.
Yeah.
And not only were school boards often ignored or overlooked by reformers, but sometimes, they were actually said to be something that should be abolished and we should
Right.
some other way to run schools. So there was a real disconnect. And I wanted to, dive into that. And
Yeah.
is originally the genesis of the book, because having sat on a school board for a bunch of years, I thought that they had very significant potential to do a lot of good and to really strengthen public education.
Yeah. The title, Why School Boards Matter, is a somewhat assertive title because you are basically presuming in that title that school boards do in fact matter. From my personal perspective, I just started working this past year with the New York State School Board Association with their annual conference. And I will say prior to that, I had a completely different perspective. And then after going through there, it was if the scales have been lifted from my eyes and I realized, getting back to that notion of accountability, it's like, these are the people who think about all the things the rest of us don't want to think about when it comes to managing a school through a difficult period of time. There's no running away from problems. Fentanyl deaths was the topic that really kind of shook me, but in a good way. And it wasn't even about the impact of fentanyl on your students. It was about fentanyl and your staff and the idea that there are real problems out there. And the scale of school boards, I think it was 82,000 school board members in the US right now. It kind of woke me up to the fact that this is an extremely important, and then to your point, under-examined aspect of our society. What were some things you discovered when you started going into this research?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started out, I was very much focused on, okay, I do believe that there's a real case to be made that school boards can improve and strengthen public education if we allow them the flexibility to make decisions at the local level and empower and invest in them. And by the way, this New York State School Board Association, and this is true in 48 states in addition to New York, because Hawaii has a central system, so they don't have a school board association. But in all other states, there are these associations that provide professional development for school board members, and now they're critical. Because no school board member comes to the job with every single skill set. For me, I was comfortable around school finance, but I didn't know school law and I didn't know as much curriculum. And associations are amazing ways to get up to speed on these issues. But when I started writing and started researching, what struck me was the role of school boards in democracy. And I think you hit on one of the real differentiators, which is that when you're a school board member, there's nowhere to hide. You're going to come once a month or twice a month, depending on the cadence of the meetings. You're going to be sitting at a table or at a dais in your local school district, in your community. And that board meeting is open to anybody that wants to attend. And before anything is voted on, there is traditionally an avenue for any community member to get up to the microphone and speak their mind.
Yeah, public comment, right?
Exactly, public comment period. And so as a school board member, you listen to this public comment period before you ultimately determine the course of however you want to vote on that now.
Right.
And when you think about it, many other elected officials at different levels, though of course they spend, chunks of their time with their constituents. If they want to, start slowing down the number of town halls that they do, slow the cadence of within their offices, they have some flexibility to do that. In the school board world, you don't. And what makes it different than any other board, nonprofit, university, corporate, is that the business has to be conducted in person, outward. It has to be recorded in front of the crowd. And there are very few things you can do behind closed doors. There are certain things, like if you have a disciplinary matter involving a particular employee or student, if you're negotiating a contract, it's permitted to happen in executive session. But for the most part, virtually everything else happens out in the open. And there's something very democratic and American about that. It's challenging, particularly in the world of social media and in the world where we have much more polarization. There's a power in that. I always say, though, when I talk to school board members, that all of us have to keep in mind that now, I think the difference between 10 years ago and now is if something happens at a school board meeting that is somewhat sensational, might be intentional, it might be unintentional. That clip could go onto social media and be there for many years to follow, and it could garner millions of hits. I just saw a clip from a district in Florida where there was a pastor that came up to the microphone and he started reading a very sexually explicit book from a middle school library. school board, and the school board was trying to shut him down. And that clip literally had over 5 million hits. So they're
Wow.
very, very viral now. And so there are consequences that are different than there used to be. But I think this fundamental aspect of it being public is very powerful.
Yeah. And political, I think, is the other element of the book that was a little surprising. Reflecting back on it, it makes complete sense. In some ways, a credit to the book is that I think the perspectives you're putting in there are things that I think I probably was thinking on my own, but I hadn't really articulated it and put it forth as important. And I think the fact that you've done that is something that we can all kind of benefit from. The name of the book is Why School Boards Matter, Reclaiming the Heart of American Education and Democracy. The democracy part of the title and the political aspect to this, I thought was quite interesting. You were just touching on it there. In some ways it feels almost like a public policy or political science book, in that there's almost like a tradition of American democracy, like the town hall, the sort of openness of local democracy and civic engagement. You touch on the extent to which there's political polarization, and social media and other things are kind of driving that. The sensational school board clips are kind of an example of that. But this idea that we collectively, those of us who are accepting that we are facing some civic challenges nowadays, the public discourse is kind of broken, if not in school boards as a place where this could begin to be addressed, where there is that public comment and there is that engagement directly with other community members. If we can't reclaim that, in some ways, the local part of federal, state, and local is kind of limping along. How do you think about that aspect of it? The fact that in some ways this is speaking to, I guess, the front lines of the battle for our democracy.
I think I'm going to answer that in 3 components.
Please.
It's an incredibly important question. And I think now, having written the book and really thought about this topic for a long period of time, it's maybe the most important question. The first is that we have a long tradition in this country of having these battles in school board meetings. And at first I thought, man, there's something different about this. But then I started looking back, and it was actually one of the most enjoyable parts of researching the book, which is looking back in the 1800s, like the early 1800s, school board meetings, to see what they were talking about. And I found all kinds of interesting things, like when they started to infuse, in addition to teaching academics, trying to teach more morality and
Right.
instruction, how to be a good person. And the fact that many, many parents in those communities were absolutely against the school stepping over the line beyond academics because they thought it was inappropriate and would ultimately lead to indoctrination.
Yeah.
Or theme to curriculum versus indoctrination that we see today. Or in the early 1900s, I found passages that looked exactly like the same passages that parents used during COVID to fight against vaccine mandates. But in the early 1900s, this was against smallpox mandates.
Right. True story. I was just checking the index and the endnotes. And when I first read the titles to a few of these things, I was like, oh, okay, vaccine stuff. Let me just double check the date. And then I literally had to double check myself because it was like 1899 and I expected it to be like 2024.
No question. I mean, the language is precisely the same. So I think in that sense, we have to come to grips with the fact that the line between government and parent control when it comes to a child's education is a difficult one to put an exact marker on. And there can be some reasonable people that have slightly different markers about where to, put that gradation. So it's to be adjudicated somewhere, and I would argue local level. The second point, which I think is maybe the most surprising thing in the book, when I first had the idea for the book and I went to some commercial publishers, their question was, what side are you on? And I'm like, talking about what side are you on? And what they meant by that was, am I writing from a progressive or a conservative perspective? And I retorted that I wasn't really doing either. I was trying to write a book about school boards, just about the subject. They said, well, I'm not interested in your book because if you're writing from a conservative perspective, we have your audience. Progressive, you have your audience. But if you're doing something that's a bit more blended, then, the audience kind of gets amorphous. But what I realized is that they weren't crazy in the sense that if we think about all the things that happen in education right now that are being fought over, almost all of them, you could say, well, this is the left view, this is the right view. Yet, when it comes to governance, there is no left versus right. I would argue that both the left and the right, red states and blue states, Democratic and Republican presidents over the course of the last, few decades, have uniformly been of the mindset to take power away from school boards and shift it to the state and to some extent, lesser extent, the federal government.
Yeah.
Been continual. And so if you think about what's happening in Florida versus New York, New Yorkers like to say, oh, I would never live in Florida because look at the crazy laws. And Floridians will say, I would never live in New York because
Yeah.
crazy laws. What New York mandates, Florida bans. What Tennessee bans, Washington State mandates.
Yeah.
But the pattern is the same. They're doing it
Right.
at the state level. And they have very heavy-handed state legislation that 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you never, ever would have seen, because back 50 or 100 years ago, school boards did almost everything. Well, school boards are much narrower in terms of their power, and there is so much that happens at the state. So that's the second piece, which is that you think everything's so polarized, but actually there's this uniform view, Democrat, Republican, of doing more at the state level to micromanage schools.
Right. Yeah. And just real quick on that one too. I know you have a third point, but in some ways you're for local control and for school boards. So like when they're asking which side are you on, it's more the side of local politics, local control. And there was a time, like our national politics have become our state and local politics. And that's something that really had not always been the case. There was more of a gradation there. And some of what you're talking about is really growing back up the local needs, the local control, because that's something that only the community itself really should be governing. It was interesting to hear an actual affirmative case for school boards. I thought that's worth noting.
Exactly. I don't for a second think that the state should just walk away and not have any role in education, because let's face it, they now fund even more, slightly more money toward public education than property taxes. And there is a need for the state. And there's a need for the federal government too. Let's face it, if we didn't have federal government intervention, then in the 1950s, we weren't able to desegregate schools. And so there are many good reasons and legitimate reasons why there's legal involvement from the Supreme Court to state Supreme Courts, why there's legislative involvement in terms of funding for Title I or for students with disabilities that come from the federal government. And at the state level, the state really does have the underlying legal responsibility and the accountability to make sure districts are doing a good job. So I think I'm all about balance. Like there needs to be a balanced approach, but I think we've lost the balance, and local control element has gone by the wayside. And that's
three-legged stools need that third leg, Scott. Speaking of which, you had a third point.
Yes. So my third point is, well, why does it need a third leg? Why is it important? Why can't every decision be made at the state, even if the state actors are incredibly goodwill? I think there are a lot of different reasons. And I think that this is so important in our polarized and fractured democracy that we live in, where we're all trying to grapple with, well, what can we do to try to make things better and understand our neighbors that might think differently than we do? I think there's no place like a school board meeting to make that happen. Because think about it, our national politics are often argued on social media. It's conspiracy theories, and you don't know the difference between fact and fiction, and you're never looking someone in the eye when you're having these discussions, because you're often conversing with like-minded people that exactly the same way as you do. And it's really the same thing at the state level. But when you think about what happens in a local boardroom, it's your neighbors. You're there in person. You look them in the eye. The same people that are with you in the grocery store or in the soccer field or in the church.
Many of the folks in that audience have kids who are attending these schools.
Exactly. And so there's a way to talk about disagreement when everybody's in the room that I think is different. And there's also a way, because it's so tangible at the local level, if there is misinformation or if there are conspiracy theories that are to set the record straight, it's much easier to do that at the local level, because you can actually point and prove to what you're trying to argue. I think if you look at even political theory, I go back to my undergraduate days reading about Alexis de Tocqueville, who is a political scientist.
You had me at the Tocqueville reference, by the way. Thank you for your service.
Yeah. Well, he made some brilliant observations about why is American democracy different than Europe.
This is a French political philosopher in the 19th century. Yes.
He came to America, he observed, and he said, whoa, you have this local layer, and the local layer does a bunch of different things. One is it makes sure that people are really engaged in their community. It increases civic engagement, and there's a benefit to civic engagement. It makes you more sort of close to, the fabric of your country. Like that's a good thing. He also said that local layer is a bit of a buffer to any law that might come from above that might be
Yeah.
authoritarian or
Yes.
be not, quite be right. And when you think about it, you could have a law passed in a state capital. And if the school board thinks that the law is crazy, they have a legal obligation to go forth and follow the law.
They have a fiduciary responsibility.
They do. But then at the same time, if you are implementing something that you believe in versus implementing something that you don't believe in, there can be a difference in the fidelity of how it's implemented. I think you see that time and time again
Yeah.
across lots of districts in the country. So there is this buffer, and you can talk about it at the board, and you can remind people this came from the state, and we don't believe it. We have to do it. It's the law, but we don't believe in it. And it gives you a voice to advocate against whatever you see coming from above that doesn't make sense. It's a pretty powerful thing. So that's a piece as well. And then I also learned when I was researching about this thing called island districts, which is basically a district that doesn't follow the politics of the state. So let's use Austin, Texas as an example.
That was going to be my example.
And the flip side, in New York, you have lots of towns on Long Island, like Smithtown, that would be conservative towns in New York that's very liberal. Every decision is made at the state level. These island districts really have very little voice because their values and their beliefs just cannot manifest itself in their schools if everything's from above. And what's interesting is the research that I found showed that island districts had a higher tendency to have issues around threats and harassment of K-12 employees than non-districts. Because I think people are pretty frustrated. If you allow some of the decision-making to happen at the local level, you have an ability to have a little bit more nuance. And it's easier for a town like Austin to exist in a more conservative state, or again, vice versa, like conservative towns in blue states. And I would argue that we want red towns in blue states and blue towns in red states. It's healthy for our democracy to understand differences. If we had states that were completely and utterly one-sided, it's going to make our union that much weaker. And I think there's a real strength to having people in your vicinity that just think very differently, right? So I feel like the way to keep island districts alive and stronger is to allow for some nuanced local decision-making so that people have a voice. I think that's a real important point. So there are a lot of these reasons where I think ultimately, like this civil discourse that we're looking for in our society, it doesn't happen that much. It does happen in boardrooms. And then the last point is that there was a recent study out of the University of Houston. They looked at 100,000 hours of school board meetings, and they looked to see how often things were really like going off the rails, where there was incredible, intense conflict. What they actually found, it's a very small number of circumstances where the conflict was unbelievably intense. And or there's a lot of disagreement, but we want that.
Right. It's a numbers game. I mean, getting back to if there's 82,000 school board members, there's a lot of board meetings. And if there's rolling live tape across the span looking for what might go viral, that's a pretty steady programming feed, but it's not all that's going on.
Exactly. And I think that at the end of the day, the vast majority of meetings are places where there's true civil discourse happening. And that's a model for our K-12 students and what we want on college campuses and what we want in our politics. And so I think that's really positive. I think the very last point is that school board elections are structured to at least attempt to be a buffer against, some of the political whims. It doesn't always, there's pros and there's cons, there's flaws, but, a lot of them are off cycle. So it separates it out from, the way elections. A lot of them, most of them are nonpartisan, not all, like community bordering state where you run associated with a party, but most states you don't. And then there's just a lot of elements of the process of running for school board that does make it a little bit less inherently political. And it's much harder to gerrymander.
Right.
We've seen that pull apart our national politics and our state politics and state houses. It's hard to do that. There's some districts that have ward systems where, sure, you can change the lines of the wards, but most districts don't. Most districts just at-large elections, and in an at-large election, unless your school district changes the lines, you can't monkey around with the election. And so I think that's a powerful protector against some of the abuses maybe of our democracy more broadly that we're seeing.
Yeah. And, I think maybe, we'll get to next is, so what do we do to defend school boards and to strengthen them? One of the things that comes to mind is the idea that it's hard to be in that role, like we were talking, but just kind of empathizing with the folks who can't really run away from the challenges we're facing as a society. It also strikes me, and you touched on this before, like there are ways to do that effectively, just allowing public comment and honestly listening to it. Folks need to feel like they're heard, they need to feel like they matter, and understanding that your job in part is to provide that sounding board back without necessarily saying a lot. I heard, why am I talking as an acronym for K-12 leadership recently, which I think teaching school boards how to engage, how to allow for comment, but still stay in control, and then also be comprised in a way that doesn't tend towards groupthink. That's the actual composition of the group board itself, just like private boards typically are seeking out different perspectives so that collectively there's more intelligence around the table based on different experience sets. What are some of your thoughts in terms of what we can do to strengthen school boards? And, I imagine there's both how to get the school boards operating better, but then also for the rest of us to engage in the conversation, to not ignore it, and to remember it is an important thing.
So I think the first piece of it is for all of us to recognize whether we're on a school board or want to run for a school board, or we're just a parent or a community member that cares about public education. Our voices do matter. And there is this way at a local level to try to have an impact and to try to seek change. Or if you're happy with everything, to express that. We all forget because we're all busy. And I think that when we're searching for how to have more connectedness in our country, maybe we should also think about not only the national and state political levels, but also our local schools as a place where we can come together. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
One of the main criticisms, and it's fair, of school boards is that the turnout for elections often is very low.
Yeah.
Many districts where 10% is not an unusual number. There are anomalies to that. And during COVID, we saw an increase in people coming out, and some of that has actually persisted. Having said that, it's still a problem. So I would say first and foremost, come out to vote. And I think a lot of people want to throw school boards away because of that. I would say it just means that we need to do a better job sending a message that voting is really important. Because the problem with the 10% vote is that any special interest group, and it doesn't matter what it is, it could be a right-wing group, it could be a left-wing group, it could be a teachers union, it could be something. They can skew the election if it's such a low turnout. But if you have a broader turnout in the local community, you're going to get a better representation of what the public wants to see reflected in that school board. So I think that's super critical that happens. What I would say is that, message for parents that I think all of us, and I'm a parent of 3 kids that went through the system. One's still in the K-12 system, the other 2 in college now, but we always see things that we think should be different. And we always see things that we think need to change in our districts. And I think that parents have a really good eye for that. And what I would encourage is that you express that. It doesn't always need to be at the microphone at a public school board meeting, although it can be. You have the right to. Yes. You could do that by reaching out to a school board member. Maybe it's a matter that's more for the principal or for the superintendent, and you go to them first. I always say when I talk to community members that do have an issue, you want to think about whether if it's a policy issue or if it's a budget issue or if it's an issue of the goals and the mission of the district, you can go to the board. If something else, start at the school level and then the work go to the district level. And then if that doesn't work, of course, you have the right to elevate that to the board level, just kind of work through the system thoughtfully so you're not going over anybody's head. It's good for the person and it's good for the system. But that voice should be heard and be taken seriously. And then, look, I think sometimes a parent can have a bit of advice on how to make the system better, and that leads to change. Other times, maybe that advice was right for that parent and their family and their kids, but not for the whole community. And that's that a school board member needs to figure out and arbitrate, because you always have to have your hat on to say what's right for the overall community, for the blend of everybody in this community, for all of the kids, for taxpayers, for the whole system, rather than for my kid or for one constituent. That's a critical piece too. And then for school board members, look, I think that it's a job that really does need a certain level of professional development, no matter who we are, to try to network with each other and learn about best practices. I've learned a ton from talking to other school board members around me, broadly in New York State, that sometimes do things differently in their district because of tradition or just because they figured out a different way. And it always gives us an opportunity to say, or gives me an opportunity to say, are there things that we should tweak about the way that, our committee structure or we conduct our meetings or however else we go about doing things. So there's so much benefit in networking and professional development.
Yeah, that's right where I was going with this too. I was wondering, based on your experience in writing the book and the research you've done, how do you think about the skills that are necessary to be an effective school board member? How do folks identify whether they have those skills and capabilities? And then if they don't have them, how would you recommend we develop them in people? It almost sounds like a lesson in citizenship and being a good community member, but what else? What are we missing? What types of skills do we need to kind of focus on developing so that these types of institutions can actually operate effectively in these challenging times?
I think the interesting thing to think about is that, so if you have a corporate board or a nonprofit board, you can almost think about the next board member that you might want to onboard based on what you're lacking. So let's say you're working in accounting skills and you need somebody to chair the audit committee. All right, you want to go out and get somebody that really understands financial statements, or you need a technology person because you're trying to innovate your company or your nonprofit.
Yeah. We made it this far without saying AI. This is like a record. Congratulations. But that's another school boards have to think about.
AI policy. But with school boards, all that gets thrown away in a sense, because school board members themselves don't really have a voice in who the next member is going to be any more so than anybody else voting. It's all the citizens. I would say what I've seen through the years is there's no recipe for the right board member, the wrong board member, or anything like that. And I think that every board needs to kind of look around and say, do we have the full package of skills, or are we missing skills? Okay, we're missing any knowledge of technology. Well, maybe we want some community members to be on a committee to advise us of technology, or maybe we need to hire a consultant to make sure we're thinking about AI the right way, or relying on our administrators who are experts in that area. So you have to look at the skill set you have around the table and then, be smart with just making sure that you fill in what you don't have. But I think most importantly, it's people that are going to take a big picture view, that they're not going to micromanage the day-to-day school district, but they're rather going to be a governing body.
Yeah.
But they're also not going to be asleep at the switch and just be a yes person to the administration. It's like micromanaging, rubber stamp. Both are bad.
Right.
You don't want your school board member micromanaging curriculum. You don't want your school board member asleep at the switch either. And so a school board member needs to understand that they can't be a micromanager, but they can't be a rubber stamp. They need to be a thoughtful governance partner for the district, and they need to empower the superintendent to run the school day to day. Need to hold that superintendent accountable for results across the board, academic, of course, but also mental health and teacher attrition and other things that we all care about to make a school district really strong. And then the other piece is listening, just listening to people in the community and not thinking that you know better than your neighbors, because actually you might learn something from your neighbors, and you owe it to your neighbors because they're empowering you, you're representing them, to listen before you make a decision. You may make your own decision, but you need to listen carefully and ensure that you're thinking about every angle. So if I can think two things, it's kind of know your lane and make sure you're being a governance partner, and then make sure that you're really being thoughtful and listening.
Fantastic stuff. I'm talking with Scott R. Levy, who's the author of Why School Boards Matter, Reclaiming the Heart of American Education and Democracy, from MIT Press. It's available wherever you get your books. Scott, it's been a great conversation. I will say I am more positive. I'm more focused on school boards coming out of this engagement. Closing thoughts, comments for our listeners, takeaways as they head back to the rest of their lives?
School boards are often overlooked. We often don't think about them, but I just encourage everyone listening to do what they can, however they feel comfortable, to be involved. Again, whether you're a parent that wants to voice a concern, or whether you're a school board member that wants to take another professional development course because ultimately you want to kind of build your skill set. And I think that there's a reason for optimism, because as much as we see stuff in the news that you look at and you're like, whoa, that's kind of nasty. Overall, I think the system that we have is a phenomenal system. And we didn't talk as much about how school boards can improve education. I think that so much can happen at the organizational level that the most well-meaning person at the state level can't do, because they don't know every district. My district may have a stress and anxiety problem in the high school because of the race to college. The district 3 doors down may have a problem with math academic outcomes, right? Or absenteeism. Like, everybody has different issues in their district. Well, the school board is the place where they can focus on the issue at hand, and they can tailor some changes that may need to be made to kind of focus in on that issue and then measure the success and be accountable. That's what school boards should be doing. And I think that there's an incredible power for school boards to improve schools. And then, naturally speaking, they're going to make our democracy healthier. And if we could do those two things, I think the country will be stronger overall. And I will have done my justice in at least bringing this topic to everybody's radar.
Awesome. Fantastic stuff. Scott, Levy, thank you for joining me on today's episode.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, please write us a review, rate the show, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.